So firstly, why bioregion? If anybody's ever heard me speak before, you may possibly have seen some of these, my quick gallop through the Duma landscape. Basically, the thing that my favorite image of all about why the world is kicking off in such alarming ways is this one, which basically describes the history of modernization and the growth of civilization from when we were hunter-gatherers without the infrastructures and the overheads of civilization, when in very round numbers we would use 1 unit of energy to get through the day, something to eat, maybe a bit of shelter, maybe something to keep warm. Whereas now, after 10,000 years in round numbers of development, progress, innovation, and creativity, the same body without drastic difference needs 60 times more resources per day to get through the day, to eat and not die. So this is described as progress and modernization, which is pretty remarkable, but what's more remarkable is that the rate of increase of our consumption of resources per person is accelerating. That guy, by the way, is the guy who climbed up the Shard in London a couple of years ago. Does this work? Yeah, going backwards. You have this accelerating energy intensity of life when averaged out over modern people, combined with an economic system that has to grow if it is not to collapse. So you know these stories. I'm just quickly repeating why it is that the world is a bit febrile at the moment. We have a physical economy which is in a finite world that unless it grows to infinity will collapse. So that is a kind of background contradiction that is not properly confronted because there isn't actually an answer to that question. What is not so clearly understood in the narrative of the difficult times we're in is the intimate, if not kind of visceral connection between the energy problem and the financialization, debt and money problem. If you look at that, the trillions of debts that people talk about in different forms, there is a complete connection between the promise or the expectation of growth of energy going through the economy and the issuance of debt against future economic activity. They are tied together. So when you see a crisis picture like that about the debt problem or the securities problem, it's actually another way of looking at the energy problem. You have an economy which is highly energy intense at a time when energy is becoming more expensive per unit to obtain for use in the economy. This causes stresses and strains, one of which is visible in the strange behavior of the financial markets. All of which is kind of known, but in a very abstract way. So this is a whole lecture called The Death of the Real, or the fact that we manage the planet or our economies to the extent that we do at all, using very abstract forms of representation, which disconnect us with all sorts of warning signs that if we weren't living in console-clad bubbles like that, we might be a bit more inclined to say, are we sure we're asking the right questions? He, by the way, is one of my favorite bizarre creatures of the modern world called a risk manager, or assistant to a risk manager. And his job is to look at all these charts and numbers going bling, 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 and say, and advise his boss whether or not certain actions correspond to their risk profile. And the beauty of risk is, well, it's the madness of it, that the company, which is most of the employers of risk managers are companies, don't then not take the action. They say, oh, how much will it cost to protect ourselves through insurance against that action? A number is created, and that goes into the business plan for their proposed action, and on they go. The fact that these actions very often lead in one way or another to the destruction of ecological and social systems doesn't matter as long as they can get it covered and somebody else pays the cost. But what is most striking about the times we live in, I love Germany for the language that it gives us, is that, which I don't really speak it, but is you have these different narratives, energy, money, debt, social and geopolitical disruptions of one kind or another, never mind climate and ecological uncertainty. Lots of different people study those things individually, but we all know, but probably only intellectually, that they can actually interact with each other. So there is the kind of perpetual possibility of some combination of trends triggered perhaps by a small action in the real world that could bring the whole house of cards down, which is what those words at the top mean. The concurrence of multiple changes, particularly when they're unexpected. So the notion of risk management against the unforeseeable combination of factors is another reason why the world is a bit fraught at the moment. So that's where we are. Very bizarrely, all the lectures that I've ever seen about the trends that are causing so much difficulty begin more or less when I was born in 1951. So I think I've decided I'm personally responsible for the end of civilization, because then that sort of basically, when I was born, was when all these multiplier effects and the geometric growth of energy, debt, and everything else started. I didn't think I was causing that at the time, but I want to apologize for when the whole thing happens. And then you begin to see, Saskia talked very brilliantly about this last night, things that look a bit weird in the world, like vast tracts of empty land or people who disappear from the statistical landscape. When from time to time somebody puts it all into one place, you have this extraordinary transformation of our world in terms of even recognizable things like jobs and employment. This is a picture from the OECD about the proportion of people who will be informal in the world by 2020. By their accounts, and they're not a particularly alarmist organization, 60% of adults in the world will be informal. I reckon that if you add to the 40% who allegedly won't be informal, those who are on short-term contracts and very precarious jobs, that's another 20%. So you probably have 20% of working age adults of the entire global population left in proper work, and they're going to be so shit scared about losing their jobs that they won't be spending money either. So you're looking here at this extraordinary transformation about the opposite of a consumer society, or in a certain sense. And if you haven't read Saskia's book, I'm going to get, but that's another wonderful description of the informal economy at street level, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Because we heard yesterday about this notion of a parallel world in which people operate outside the statistics and outside the control systems, to some extent, of economic management. This is this book that's just come out about informal markets. It's a fantastic atlas of these vast spaces where people do their trading and the flows of goods of one sort or another outside the normal system. So we're used to seeing pictures of, container ships or logistics hubs or Amazon warehouses. That is true and real. But this is probably the faster growing bit of the picture, is this kind of, it's not chaotic, but it's very much a different qualitatively form of economic logistical activity. And the other thing we don't see, because it's in strangely distant places, is the terrible sort of depletion of security and quality in the work that is formal. This is in Ethiopia, where 20,000 people are working in a shoe factory for $35 a month. They have jobs, they are secure, they are in the formal economy, and they are earning $35 a month. And the consequences of it, this is just one bit of this shoe city. Great swathes of Africa and other parts of the world are being created into informal special economic zones. So when you saw that OECD picture about 20% of the population being in proper jobs, a big chunk of them will be in that sort of proper job. And I heard this word terrestrialization from I met a man, I went to a seminar about land grabbing, and I wanted to know more about it. So money people are not stupid, as you obviously know. They have recognized that land is finite. There are 6-7 billion people, all of whom need to eat. And they say, when they see a sort of an opportunity called land has been relatively cheap, 6 billion hungry people, that's a good investment opportunity. So there are people grabbing land around the world, and that's one of the many sort of pictures of this absolute rampant, but only just getting started, grab for the productive resources that are left in the world. Do not be misled by this virtualization story. We need food, we need material things to carry on, and many people know that. What you see at the top is what they turn into, and the significant thing about that is there are no people on it. That's an African industrial plantation that probably 5 years ago had several hundred farming families on it. So when you see on the television this terrible, shocking picture of migrants coming out of thin air to flood into our countries, we are very directly implicated in the reasons they are coming, because they, in very large part, 40 to 45% of the people in the last UK migrant arrivals come from countries where there has been land grabbing on a large scale, and the other 60% come from countries where the state has actually been destroyed by our military activities. So anyway, when you see strange aliens like that, we are directly implicated in their necessity to arrive, and that the metabolic rift explains the bizarre decisions that we make, the fact that we tolerate institutions that are so clearly dysfunctional, that we think it's normal to have an economy that grows to infinity in a finite world, only because we are so profoundly separated from the lived and the embodied and the earthy could we even contemplate such things. But that's civilization for you. And Tim Morton, who's has a great epigram, the good way to think about the metabolic rift is never mind worrying about what's coming. The worst thing has already happened, namely, we have already lost contact through modern civilization with the world, the planet, the biosphere, and living systems. Therefore, we are survivors. We are coping with the consequences of the great calamity, which is another way of saying that things can only get better, which I'm not going to say that, but one could say that. So that is why the world is kicking off and why all sorts of dreadful and very alarming, if sort of hard to understand things are going on in the world, my quick interpretation of that. And as I said at the beginning, I therefore have spent 30 years trying not to get obsessed by the bad things, but look for things that are examples of better things, namely signals of change in sort of academic terms or spaces of hope in activist terms. And I'm just going to show you examples pretty randomly of what I think are activities that, for example, I should have explained that the metabolic rift more or less defines why it's, in my experience, crazy to talk about cities as a thing by themselves. Cities are 100% dependent on the flows of nutrients of various kinds to be alive at all. So smart cities that don't think where their lunch is coming from are not smart. But that's just kind of, in this very interesting meeting, there's been no great acceptance of the notion that smart cities are by themselves a rational proposition. But more importantly, there's large numbers of cases in which people are saying, hey, wait a minute, I may live in a city, but I would like to be connected to the outside of my city in one way or another. And there's lots of examples of that happening, which is what I'm going to show you now. From notions of artificially, by design, adding bio-intensity to city landscapes in a very kind of mechanical but not bad way. There are now funds in Europe, there are targets for biodiversity in cities, so there are people who will build a functional farm, reed beds, all those kind of add-ons or plug-ins of nature or living things to cities, becoming quite a big business. And because it's kind of a policy directive as well as a cultural shift, not unimportant. What is more, I think, significant is that in the most unlikely places, people are having much more ambitious plans than just to have a reed bed at the bottom of the civic park. This is my friend Elias Catan, who is an architect in Mexico City. So I don't know how many of you have been to DF, but it's pretty alarmingly violent and, interestingly, not very green city, except that Elias, amongst with many people, is absolutely determined to reconnect DF with its rivers and its history as a very kind of water-based culture. That's a long story about things that would need to happen for it to be practicable. The point is that his project is a cultural project attached to a fairly serious infrastructure project, attached to the interest of the city government in finding some way or another to just change the course of development that they're on at the moment. So they're beginning to do pilot real-world projects of digging up bits of river and streams around the edges of the city. That is the beginning of something that Elias is quite convinced that once you start, you can actually amplify the way that the water and the living streams come back into what looks like unpromising territory. Paris had this big competition a couple of years ago called How Can We Be the Most Green City in the World, big capital, One of the metaphors that came out was Paris as a sponge. Sadly, that didn't actually get implemented. They spent the money on a high-speed train network to the business districts. But anyway, the world is an imperfect place. That metaphor has been extraordinarily powerful in France, and there's 3 or 4 cities now using sponginess as a kind of metaphor for how they to think about the physical development of their city. So sponge is something you wouldn't associate with Paris normally, but it's part of the dialogue and the vocabulary being used. Lots of people, not just in the development world, are now understanding that everybody in the world can say that they're smart, but not everybody in the world can say that they're Plymouth, because each city and each place is unique. So the notion that uniqueness of place, the embodiedness of place, the historical qualities of place cannot be branded or invented by consultants has given lots of people the confidence to say, well, by the way, our place is different from your place, and let's use that, the differences that we have inherited through history, as the basis of our development strategies. And that let's celebrate the fact that we are different, but learn from each other how to exploit historical qualities, cultural assets, ecological assets in our places and cities. And you're seeing a lot more, well, I am, examples of people doing cultural work not as a kind of academic exercise, but as a way to refresh the notion of what development and progress can be in their place. This is the year of the soils, and I knew literally nothing about the soils until 1.5 years ago when I went on a course up a mountain in France where I live to learn about how to do artificial soil making as practiced in Mali with a French agroecologist. Now everywhere you go there are people telling us or doing things about soil. And by the way, if you haven't been to the gallery, how many of you have been into the soil exhibition at the end of this room? Hands up. About 2. Anyway, perfect example. Far too cerebral, you're all far too media people. Go and spend 5 minutes in the end of this building. It's a fabulous show. There's 2 or 3 very, very beautiful little things. And you could say, right, tick, done year of soils. Lots of people doing it in more interesting ways. So here are people in Sweden that I've been working with who set up a soil academy. Bunch of designers, basically, young designers. This was last year also in Sweden, where we had 52 architects and urban planners, either postdocs or professionals, who you would think, because they're like you, I thought this is absolutely too hard to even imagine selling this lot on soils. Absolutely like pushing at an open door. I said, find a way to make the subject of soils interesting. So they scampered around the island that we were on for our summer school and invented, well, they didn't invent, I discovered later, they made a soil tasting ceremony in which they had 2 glasses for each stand, one of which had a sort of tisane of a leaf or a fruit from the island that they'd found somewhere, next to a sample of the soil in which it had grown. And the game was taste the tisane and then taste the soil and see if you could make a connection between the quality of the tree or the leaf that the tisane had been made of. Well, it was just fantastic. You have to take my word for that. The main thing being that these are hardcore planning, abstraction, big data, MEDIACITY types, and they had a really wonderful time and are completely now on board the soil train. And this was somebody I met here who is doing something vaguely similar. There are dozens of projects around this region to do with finding ways to manage and understand the landscape of South Devon in ways that connect citizens with scientists. So the general activity of monitoring peat bogs, understanding mosses, and helping the professionals keep an eye on how things are going in terms of the restoration or the slowing down the degradation of the peat is very wide. I didn't go on it, I'm going to go next time. But all over the place, you're seeing people becoming this sort of pro-am investigation of landscapes, hands-on, knees in the ground, knees in the mud. 1 square at a time, rescue Mother Earth from car parks and tarmac and asphalt. Now, actually, it's admittedly Portland, but that is now the part of the official city concept of Portland, Oregon, is to depave X amount of square yards a year in order to create space for urban farming, for rainwater capture, and so on and so forth. So 4 or 5 years ago, it was a kind of activist, mad artist activity. Now it's official part of the Portland's green infrastructure and is being looked at by other cities. This is a Devon thing. Have you heard of dangerous dads? Who's heard of dangerous dads? Very big in America is reconnecting children with nature and rewilding. Here, there's a big problem in the UK, so I'm told, about far too many health and safety regulations. So there's a volunteer organization of fathers who take little children to very dangerous woods and just let them fall out of trees and fall into rivers. And they look very traumatized as a result, as you can see. Physically remaking things. I showed you the stuff from Dartmoor, people testing the land. Incredible. I don't have a number, but there were many hundreds of examples of people physically with their hands remaking damaged rivers and creeks and waterways near where they live. Not just as here, where they have this, they take the willows and turn them into kind of barricades, but this notion of using artists so that things to protect waterways can look beautiful as well as function beautifully. I really love that because it's 100% an ecological technical intervention, but if you just bring along somebody with a sensibility, say, well, can't this look nice as well as be nice? Answer, yes, it can. Then that creates a tremendous sense of pride in a waterway, which is not always something easy to do. These are some friends of mine in Philadelphia who, for 12 years, have been kind of going up and down culverts, stinking holes in the ground, and rebuilding bits of their river, creating what they call the 12-mile watershed. It's one of many dozens of groups saying, well, either we can demand that the government or the mayor fixes our city, or we can start to do it ourselves. And they are just, you create 12 miles of functioning, moderately healthy river, which wasn't there before. It was either physically concreted over or abandoned or obscured. Farm schools cropping up everywhere. Nothing original. They were very common in the 1930s, the last time we had an economic crisis of this scale. So people rediscover solutions that work. If we need children and young people to reconnect and cross over that metabolic rift, you just have to take them out and get them to work on a farm. That is pretty much 50% of the curriculum. But just to kind of emphasize that it's not just about nice flower arranging type activities. This is a group in Amsterdam who are physically inventing a new form of grey water system for a quite large suburb about 4 minutes north of the Amsterdam station, for those of you who know Amsterdam. And they are working with the city government, with the water companies, with the infrastructure people, and they're providing a lighter weight, more ecological, radically cheaper way to begin to modernize in green terms their water system, using a sort of, again, pro-am volunteers and professionals, slipping in a mushroom activity, of course, in the background there. This is my biggest heroes of all. This is in Tucson, Arizona, and right across this on the Watershed Management Group, who invented the pro-am model of digging up a street, retrofitting water tanks and berms, and letting the space for the water to be either captured or whatever. Started off as 100% volunteers. Now there's like many dozens of groups working hand in hand with city governments. So that is green infrastructure as social energy and professional amateur combinations, which is now yielding jobs in the form of jobs that didn't exist at all 5 years ago, such as somebody to test the soil prior to the team coming to dig up a street in that way.